Welcome to the They Learn You Win podcast from Scoops. I'm your host, David Wentworth. And on today's episode, I talked to Geoffrey Roche, who's Director of Workforce Development for Siemens Healthineers. Geoffrey's also known as a heart leader. So what does that mean? Well, that means that Geoffrey, he leads organizations, in his words, by embedding a culture of empathy, resilience, purpose-driven transformation. And as he likes to say, he transcends traditional boundaries. And that's definitely true. We had a very interesting conversation about what it means to develop and sustain a corporate culture in today's environment. We touch on diversity, equity, inclusion, and what's going on in the world today around that. So a very thoughtful and meaningful conversation with Geoffrey. So I hope you enjoy it. So Geoffrey, thank you so much for joining me today. I've been actually sort of waiting for the right guest to talk about this topic with. It's been on my mind quite a bit lately. And I've been thinking about it a lot, and having met you, I know that you think about this a lot, just sort of what's going on. I mean, it's what you've been thinking about for a very long time. I just think we're at a moment in time where it's very important. So for me, what's the genesis of this is the new focus on things like diversity, equity, inclusion in the within the organization, which also sort of touches on overall organizational culture and just sort of the life at work. And obviously that's somewhere that you spend a lot of time and expertise working on. So I wanted to talk to you about that, about this moment that we're having. And things are changing rapidly almost every day. And so we had a couple of years there where there's this big focus and push in one direction on DEI initiatives and how do we do this better. And you've got processes and functions and roles being created. And now we're in a moment where all of that is being rolled back and rather rapidly. So if you want to just give a little bit of, insight into why this is what you think about and what your work centers around this, and then we can sort of get into what we think is happening.
Well, and David, thank you for certainly the opportunity, and as well as, thank you for bringing such an important topic really into dialogue here, right? I mean, when I look at this, to your point, for so long, we've had organizations of all sizes, especially over the last few years, but even before that, really start to emphasize that ultimately from a workforce perspective, as well as from a culture perspective in our organizations, we have to focus on people. And as part of that focus on people, we have to think about the important topics of belonging, the important aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think, certainly what we've seen at this time post the last election is much of what we are seeing is exactly actually what we were told would happen during the election. Without question, we were certainly made aware that there would definitely be a larger emphasis to no longer prioritize these important matters, at least at the federal government level. I don't think as many people understood that may have a dramatic impact through executive orders, through how the government can regulate organizations that do business with the federal government, which certainly is having a dramatic and pretty significant causal effect on organizations who have, many of which, been much more stronger proponents of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, who are now saying, well, we've got to review all of our policies. We have to review how we approach these things. We need to change titles. We need to de-emphasize this as a business priority. Whatever the case is, every organization is going about this in specific ways that they feel is right. And it also depends upon how their legal team is assessing and reviewing the potential impact to them. But what I try to remember, particularly as a gay man in this process, is there's lives at the other end of this. And these lives, especially when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, in most cases, these are individuals who already are predisposed to having mental health challenges, and many of which, particularly in the LGBTQ plus community, higher percentage of potentially ending their own life. And ultimately, decisions that are made, the way we talk, the way we treat one another, has a bigger impact, right? And so I have often said that I just hope people actually think about not just how this impacts their culture, that's important for sure, but also how every decision they make could either make it or break it for another colleague. And I just hope people have some element of compassion and empathy around that, because I think for me, this goes much deeper than just being about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. For me, it truly goes to the core of every one of us desires community. That doesn't mean you and I have to agree, but we can be respectful. We can be courteous. And I just wish we would see more of that.
True enough. And it's interesting that you even brought that up and mentioned it. It's something that's been coming up a lot in the work that I've been doing is trying to get a focus on empathy. And it's, I've been doing it in a very small lens of just within the scope of learning and development within an organization, right? Not these much bigger issues that we're currently discussing. But, whenever I'm asked, what's, a key piece of advice you'd give to learning leaders? What's something that you want to them to remember? And I always say, regardless of the specific L&D topic I'm talking about, is remember that it's people that we're talking about. All of this, we're all just people. It's very easy. We all do it. I come from a research background where you look at data and everything is 80% of organizations do X, 30% of organizations do Y. So all of a sudden you start to think of this amorphous blob, which is an organization. So you're already completely dehumanized, that there's no people. And then you start talking about workers, learners, employees, all of these things. It's very easy to insert these degrees of separation that we're talking about people at the end. So I think really ultimately the end of what we do is anything that you're trying to do, if you can infuse it with some sort of empathy that, okay, what am I trying to accomplish with that person on the other end? How do I get there? So I'm really happy to hear you say that and put it in those terms because, you know, I want to unpack some of the things that we're talking about because it's interesting is this is seen by some as well. This is sort of the inevitable pushback against what was seen as the legal push for DEI initiatives, right? So the idea that there was this thinking, well, you're forcing from a legal standpoint that we have to do these things. And so now suddenly the coin has flipped and it's, well, now you're maybe in legal trouble if you are doing these things. And that's can be just the concept in either direction is scary. And then also how do we move forward when it's so uncertain? I'd like to hear from you because this is the work that you do, regardless of what's going on with the noise outside. What are some of the things companies or leaders can think about to ensure that they're still adhering to some of these principles without having to wade into this broader, controversy?
I think ultimately what we're seeing, right, is to your point, is we're seeing some organizations really continue to say, you know what, this is a priority of us, and we're gonna take on whatever risk potentially is submitted or directed at our way. Certainly, we're seeing some organizations make that determination. We've certainly seen some of the bigger businesses do that. And then we're also seeing some that are really in many ways shocking to see. If you look at an organization like Target, I mean, Target was chastised in a very dramatic way, just last year when they had, the work that they did around their Pride collection and how, apparel and such. And then now, they've made a decision, obviously, to really, in many ways, we would argue, de-emphasize their commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. What I'm definitely seeing, though, is I think it's becoming more common to see organizations that are still very rooted in the purpose of this, just make decisions to change the title, but not necessarily change the direction. And so I've seen some great examples, in the healthcare space and other industries where, they're saying instead of a chief diversity, equity, inclusion officer or chief diversity officer, they're making a decision to call them a chief belonging officer or something around community, something around culture, chief culture officer, etc. Which I think for certain certainly potentially gets them out of that element of they're just trying to push DEI. Now, I always struggle, particularly when it comes to these things, because ultimately, yes, I'm sure there were some people who really did push DEI, just like other people push a lot of different things. But I think when you get to the heart of it, people's intent in advancing diversity, equity, inclusion is always been about belonging. It's always been about acceptance. It's always been about listening, valuing, appreciating one another. And I do think it's really important that organizations truly think about that. Certainly, I've seen organizations also think about how it is that they can, in a different way, leverage their employee resource groups so that it doesn't necessarily come across as if they do work with the federal government, they're not pushing quote unquote an agenda. And so I think there's a lot of careful thought being put in, again, by executives at different levels, by chief legal officers, by chief human resource officers who are trying to, kind of thread that needle very carefully if they do business in some way with the federal government, because obviously the risks are pretty clear. Now, whether that holds up constitutionally in the future, again, we shall see. But I think that there is a lot of thought to put into this. But I think to your point earlier that you made so eloquently, we have to remember the impact on people. I know that I come at this issue as a gay man of white privilege. So very different. I have health insurance access. I've had resources to deal with, what it was like to come out as a 39-year-old, actually I was 38, but 39 now, uh, gay, leader in healthcare. Not everyone has that same level of access. Not everyone has the same level of support. Not everyone has therapy in the same way that I do. And when I think about particularly a recent survey that just came out, I think just last week, that highlighted the concerns that LGBTQ plus workers have within their organizations, where they did not necessarily have as many concerns just a few months ago, and now are overwhelmingly concerned because they feel like they can't be who they are. They feel like they can't express their concerns, not because they have leaders who don't like them or respect them, but because organizationally they've seen these changes and ultimately they know the impact that it has on them. I also think a lot about our younger workforce, because the reality of it is that, we also sit at a time where retention is such a challenge. And, ultimately we're talking about a disengaged workforce, whatever we want to call it. Well, here's the fact. For those leaders of organizations that are sitting out there making decisions to de-emphasize or deprioritize diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, guess what? Your retention is going to get worse. Your culture is going to get worse. People are going to leave your organization and look for another organization if that's an issue that they care deeply about, because guess what? They will do it. We've seen it. And I think we're only going to see that happen more and more, which obviously means changing guard in a lot of different elements of our workforce, which, certainly gets to a lot of different elements as well. I think the area that really concerns me, particularly when I look at, what's happening out there, is particularly among, our wonderful colleagues and friends that are transgender. When you look at the words, when you look at the executive orders, when you look at what has been put forward to that community, I get very, very concerned, because in essence, we're asking to erase the very DNA of these people. We're asking to hide who they are. And we're basically telling them that it's the official policy of the federal government that there's only man and woman, which means they don't exist. And my message to all of them is, you absolutely exist. And no one, no leader, whether in government or private business or whatever, should ever seek to divide us rather than unite us. And these are individuals that contribute in our military, contribute in our organizations, contribute as parents, contribute as brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, relatives, friends. They go to church. They don't go to church. They go to synagogues. They go wherever. But here's the deal. They deserve to be respected. They deserve to be heard. And they also deserve to be loved. I get concerned about that because for certain, the thing that I always try to remember when we talk about these matters is, last year we had a very strong survey that suggested organizationally across the globe, but very focused in the US, that mental health was the worst it's ever been in the workplace. Well, imagine if that survey was done today. It's only going to be worse. And imagine if you're dealing with that stress in the workplace and then you go home and you're dealing with it. We are literally deciding through executive orders to I would argue, put our Americans and put our world at risk over issues that shouldn't even be, frankly, an issue of the federal government.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's driven supposedly from this place that says, well, everything needs to be merit based, and so by definition, anything that has occurred under the auspice of DEI is not somehow based on merit, which is I just think that's the completely wrong place to start the argument. That's not true. And I think what's crazy about it is there's enough studies out that show the more diverse an organization is from almost any definition, the more successful they are, the more productive the workforce is, the better the workforce um, feels. There's many reasons why this has got my attention and has got me really thinking about these things. But I do also worry about slippery slopes and this idea that does it stop here? Because as people who work in these industries, and I work for a learning technology company, I've worked for analyst firms that look into the L&D and HR generally, right? So those fields has done tremendous work over the years of how do we make work better? Because let's be the goal is we want everyone to work. Okay, so they have to work somewhere. Well, what do we want to happen while they're there? We want them to be productive, successful. We want them to enjoy their life. So there's a lot of effort that's gone into how do we make things more people centric? How do we build a good work culture? All these efforts. And to me, I think there was a time when you wouldn't have believed that this backsliding on DEI would occur, which it is now. So I think people would tell me, "Oh, well, you're crazy. We'll never dial back this movement towards better workplace culture." But why wouldn't we? Because I think I've seen organizations pretty quickly turn their back on DEI in some cases. And so who's to say that it doesn't make sense for them as a business to say, well, you know what? All I want people to do is show up and do their job. And I don't want to hear about whether they like it or not. I don't care what happens on their way there. I don't care what happens on the way home. Just do your job. Are we going to go back to that sort of, the Jack Welch GM forced ranking and just do it and be quiet? And it sounds like a silly argument to make, but we've seen how quickly things can change. And so that worries me. All this work towards people-centric. I mean, am I crazy or do you think it's even possible?
I think it's 100% possible, right? And I think to your point, we're seeing it pretty quickly, in our very eyes, right? But here's the thing. I think that certainly should give us hope. I'm not so sure the younger generations are going to put up with this.
Hope not.
And particularly in the workplace, we're about to see significant change of the guard when it comes to leadership. And, certainly millennials have put forward, this is not the way they view this. And certainly the younger workforce, which are our future leaders, certainly do not either. Now, the concern, right, is that they're also in many ways very affected by all this while they come up through to be our future leaders. And I think it's incumbent upon us that believe in these causes so much to be there to remind them that just like the battle for civil rights, we have to stay engaged and be willing to get into good, necessary trouble, as Congressman John Lewis said, on these matters as well. We have to be willing to have these conversations, even when it puts ourselves potentially at risk, because ultimately our risk becomes our gain collectively in these causes. We have to be willing to challenge these individuals that are making these decisions, and we have to be willing to educate. Because here's the reality to your point, right? So much of the movement to really embrace diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging happened through a lot of social justice matters. If you look at, obviously the brutal murder of George Floyd, and then what happened after that murder of George Floyd from a corporate perspective, and then to think only a couple years later, we're taking that step back. Well, here's the reality. Like in the civil rights era, we took steps forward and then we took steps back. We've got to be engaged. One of the things I think we have to do maybe differently than maybe we've tried before, and I've been writing on this, even from a workforce culture standpoint, recently, even with WebMD and others in the space of the healthcare arena, that we've got to engage the boards. We've got to engage shareholders to really help them. And I know that's a little harder on the for-profit side, a little easier certainly on the nonprofit side, but we've got to educate them, because here's the reality to your point. We know that when we've seen the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging move forward, business profitability also happens. So why is it that we're de-emphasizing just because of fear over how we're going to get, responded to by the federal government or not? We still don't know how the courts are going to react in many cases. And we know that attorney generals in many states are going to challenge these matters because they care deeply about these matters, and they should. I also do believe that we have got to remind ourselves, these issues are going to require the power of storytelling because, you know, when the midterm election comes around and, Congress is up at that time, both the House and Senate, I think people have a lot of things they have to answer. Is this the direction that they want to go? Because to your point, what we're seeing is a dramatic shift, particularly at the corporate lens. And I've always said, follow the money, right? When you look at the money that was contributed to even in the last inauguration, and then you look at the corporate changes that are occurring, follow it because you could see how much has changed. I'll give you an example. I recently had an opportunity to tour one of the headquarters of Amazon. And we all know that for a long time Amazon was really prioritizing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Still to this day, when you go to Amazon, you will see a very inclusive workplace. But now, as we know, they're one of the organizations that at least has put a pretty external note out that they're not going to focus on it as much because of the changes in the federal government. And they're also an employer that has made everyone come back into the office. And while I was there, I asked one of their corporate leaders about the impact of that return to office. And I asked them questions related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And the answer I was given was, I don't know the answer to that, but I can try to find out for you. Well, we all know the answer to that. Most of their workforce are individuals that ultimately are dramatically impacted by these types of decisions. They don't have the same access that many of us do. They don't have the same security, the same protections, the same safety. And let's be honest, there may be members of their workforce, just like many other workforces today, who are afraid that by showing up to work could be the decision that ultimately gets them taken away by ICE. These are dramatic effects.
Mhm.
I recently was in New Mexico visiting and meeting with a hospital system and a community college. And, I can remember sitting down with the chief nursing executive and another leader from their chief learning officer and the president of this community college. And they were conversing as I arrived about the fact that they were just recently informed that, in their case, ICE could just come into the hospital and take a worker or a patient right out of the hospital if that was the decision that ICE was doing. I'm not suggesting that ultimately this is, something that all of us need to be thinking about from a diversity, equity, inclusion perspective, but we do need to think about it from a people perspective because ultimately people have to be worried today about all those matters. And as leaders, we should be as well because ultimately that's community. And when that happens to one, it's going to happen to others. And so certainly we're seeing that on the news. And so those types of things also have to be thought of because the workers are just in a really challenging time right now.
Very much so. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And, I think as hard as it can be, and there's a lot of, well, what can I do? That question comes from literally not knowing what you can do to, I know what I could try to do, but I don't think I should, and so everyone's sort of in that space. But I really think that, again, bringing it back to sort of just for the purposes of the podcast and the audience, the L&D community, to me, it's, it's probably a good place to start standing up a little bit, at least, for the work that you do, because so much of the people that I know in this industry have put a lot of work into DEI initiatives and the sort of learning and the content that goes into helping people understand what that is, what it means, why it's important, why it's successful, those kinds of things. And so even if you want to get into just, let's say, forget about the politics of it and just maybe your organization, that's just not what you care about. That's fine. That's their prerogative as an organization, right? But if it is something that your organization cares about, um, maybe you need to start figuring out how to make that stand, because you can look at it just from a selfish standpoint. What does this mean for your career? Because this industry, there's not going to be a future, right? Oh, we have this great new technology for awards and recognition, or this new technology that for corporate culture, maybe there won't be a need anymore. Anything sort of people related, that entire industry might not exist, or at least exist in a very small shadow of its former self. So, it just depends on where do you think that the line is, right? Where do you think it is? And it's probably behind you. And it's not way out in front of you. So I just think it's important we start to think about things. I mean, I know for like my organization, we've just got a very diverse organization, and there isn't necessarily some process or edict or function that makes it that way. It's just our organization, and it's the culture that we just have. And as a learning vendor, we provide that content to our customers. Like, how do we do better with the E&I? So, I mean, it matters to us. And, I think you can find a place on the spectrum where it matters to you. It just depends on where you want to, I think, make a stand if you can.
I agree. And look, I mean, I think to your point, right, for the L&D community that has worked so hard around career and talent mobility, in my opinion, you can't achieve career and talent mobility without these important priorities, because ultimately equity has to be at the foundation of career and talent mobility. I mean, when we think about, in the space I know the best is, which is healthcare, we know the evidence is so strong that when we have a clinical care team that looks and, can relate to the patients that they serve because of connection on culture, connection on ethnicity, connection on understanding from a health literacy standpoint, we know that the quality of that care improves. That's evidence-based. We've seen it time and time again. And so, why we would de-emphasize that just because we're concerned, because the impacts of Medicare, because obviously hospitals are a federal contractor, I think we have to really think about, because again, we're there to support our patients, and our patients deserve equitable care. And we have to think about how it is and how we approach that, right? And I've been certainly encouraged by a lot of healthcare systems that have said, look, we can change titles, we can make some minor aspects that change things, but we're not going to de-emphasize the priority we have to take care of our patients and give them the highest quality care, because the highest quality care is still equitable. And so I think there are still ways to be thinking about this and sort of respect, with a little r, these executive orders, but ultimately with a big R, respect people. That's where I think we have to be thoughtful here. And to your point, I think CLOs and learning and development functions have, in my opinion, a massive responsibility, in addition to the chief human resource officers and to the other executives that are responsible for leading people, to sit there and say, enough is enough. Our people need our support, and we have to give them that necessary support.
I hope that's sort of what happens in the moment, right? What gets driven here, because there's other things. I mean, there's a lot of ancillary things that can be affected. One of the things that I think about now in this environment is, again, what's next? And I think of all the work that's been done around accessibility over the last few years, right? Making sure that, we think of it from a learning content standpoint. It's everything from, is this content suitable for people who are colorblind, right? That can tell the difference between the two things that you're sharing. Do you have alt text in your images? All of this work that's gone into creating, more accessibility around the workplace. Is that another area is that next, where, it's too much effort. You're doing that at the expense of something else. So we shouldn't do that anymore. Again, I just think is that too much too, or you think that's even possible?
Look, I think what we've seen thus far, anything is possible, right? And I think this is where we have to stand up and advocate. There's an amazing organization in healthcare called the Gold Foundation, which has made a cornerstone of their work with the medical education community, both, medical schools, nursing, hospitals, and healthcare systems, and even med tech, et cetera, companies. This idea that humanism should always be at the forefront of everything that we do. And I would say right now, that's where we have to be focused on this. If all the CEOs of these large organizations would sit there and say that that's not how we're going to run our businesses, I think things could be very, very different. These matters take courage. I look at the CEO of Disney as an example. Obviously, and no company is perfect, but I mean, Bob Iger has made some very dramatic decisions in his time as a CEO that obviously had a business risk. But I think that we've got to be willing to do this when it deals with our people.
Hmm.
And frankly, remember, there's families that are also connected to those people. This is livelihood that we're talking about. And, I just think about, to your point, unfortunately, anything is possible. But at what point do we also think about the dramatic effects of this over time? How does this become, a hole that becomes so hard to dig out of? And I think that if executives and others are willing to challenge this, maybe we wouldn't be as so far into it.
Yeah, that's for sure. Like the time to say something was a while ago, probably, and the next best time is now, right? So, all right, so this, not to be obvious, this has been relatively doom and gloom a little bit, but I think this comes from a place of hope from both of us, right? The reason why we're talking about it is that we think that it's other things are possible. So, in that spirit, I would ask you, just from your work over the years, do you have like an anecdote that you like to share, or something you use when you're at a conference, or if you're speaking, that just sort of highlights like success or something positive from this concept of belonging, or anything around corporate culture that you point to that says this was really cool to witness, or to be a part of.
Yeah, I have seen some amazing work done in this space that didn't outwardly label it as diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging just because they knew sort of ahead of the time that somebody's going to want to de emphasize their work if that was the case. But yet they got the same level, without question, of accomplishment done. I think of a healthcare system that I know well in Wisconsin that has built by far some of the most impactful workforce programs in the nation, from career pathways, youth apprenticeships, even launched 2 apprenticeship degrees with a technical college. And they've studied year over year, over a period of years, how it's diversified their workforce, bringing in young students who ultimately became professionals, who ultimately now are becoming nurses that started as a medical assistant. And I can remember I had an opportunity to visit this hospital system last year and meet with so many of these employees. And I mean, they literally took, just among their medical assistant population, a 4%, they were 4% diverse in terms of, 96% uh, white dominated among their medical assistants, to over 30 some percent now, of all different cultures, ethnicities, as compared to that 4% in just a couple of years. Some may argue that's pushing an agenda. No, actually, what that's doing is it's giving hope and opportunity to a population that didn't have it before. It's giving that workforce an opportunity to grow, and they're growing from a medical assistant to an LPN, from an LPN to an RN, from an RN to a bachelor's prepared nurse, and so on, going on to become a nurse practitioner, etc. And let's not forget, they are also benefiting the local economy.
Of
And so, you
course.
know what that also is? It's economic development. And so when we think about this, this work is truly also about community and economic development. And I will say this, look, this is where we as an L&D field, this is where we as a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging field also have work to do. I'll argue, and a good colleague of mine who built that very program has said this to me all the time. She's the sister of an openly gay brother. She's the mother of children that are also part of the LGBTQ plus community. And she has said to me, "You better believe I built these programs with that needle and thread in every part of them." She's like, "It's part of the fabric of every part." She's like, "But I knew in the state of Wisconsin, where we change governors every term usually, that if I called it this, it's not going to get the same level of support. But if I focus on economic opportunity, if I focus on economic development, I will get there." And the reality of it is that she's built everything that you would want from a DEI lens into it, but she's done it correctly. And also, I'll add, she's done it strategically, because she was prepared for this. And so we have to also think differently about how we approach this. And so the message I would give people is, look, we've been at this, as I said earlier, in the civil rights movement. This is not a time to give up. This is certainly not a time to give in. This is a time to stand up, shoulder to shoulder. This is a time to challenge respectfully. And this is a time to ask all the questions that we need to ask. to simply say, where is the humanity in this decision, or where is the humanity in this conversation? And this is a time to talk to everyone possible in this field to remind us that we are there for people. We are there to help them achieve their dreams. And when we focus on that, I'm confident we have a much better future. And certainly right now we may feel.
Yes, for sure. I mean, and it's like the principles of all this need to stand, right? You can let them have the terminology, but the principles have to stand and be supported and developed. So focusing on that and not so much on what we call it in the process, but really focusing on what's at the core there, I think is important. And you brought it up too, and it's something that comes. I tell L&D leaders all the time, the biggest thing you can do is be able to show the impact you're having. You can't just say, oh, we got people to take the class. No one cares. What's the impact, right? And that's just the small slice of showing why the work that you do in this particular area for L&D is important, right? You're just trying to show, this program I put together is important because as a business, it was affected this way, this behavior change, this performance change, whatever it is. But this is now on a much bigger scale. You mentioned it's all about the outcomes. If you are in that mindset of being able to show the impact that you're having in the work that you do, you can weather a storm like this by saying, these are the principles that I'm adhering to and I'm applying them. And as a result, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened. You're saying about this economic growth and supporting the community. And I add one other thing to that. I think that it is also very economic, and businesses see as success is customers like to see themselves
Mhm.
when they're interacting with an organization, and especially if it's something very personal like healthcare. You're in that hospital, you're in that facility, to see that place look like the world around you, I think is huge. And companies time and time again, that's why these initiatives started in the first place, is that companies recognized that this is something we haven't done, we should probably pay more attention to it, and here's all these positive outcomes why. I mean, on its face, as just as humans, it should be enough, but clearly in the business world, it's not. So what are the actual, business impacts that we're having? So just try to apply that mindset, the thing that you've been trying to do already in the work that you do, right? Trying to show the impact you're having. Same goes for this, and that's you'll be able to sort of tell that story. As you say, it's the storytelling, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. As much as some of this stuff brings me down when we talk about it, and that we're even having to talk about it, I think I'm glad that you and I are talking about it, and I got this opportunity to have a conversation, because I think it's a conversation that gets avoided a little bit from time to time, and so I'd like more people to have it. And I'm glad I could have it with you. And I always think I'm the last person anybody wants to hear from when it comes to these things, but I feel like I should at least do what I can to see how I see it impacting the world around me. So that's all I'm trying to do. But I appreciate your insights and the work that you do and will continue to do. Anything coming up in your near or distant future that you want to mention before I let you go?
The one thing I would mention certainly is, there's a lot of great organizations doing some incredible work in this space. And one of them, David, I don't know if you're familiar with, but it's called Call for Culture.
Hmm.
Their founder, Angela, is a former, chief human resource officer, and she has done an incredible job of really working with organizations and individuals to remember their purpose and their meaning around this. And they do a lot of really great work, and Angela's been just an incredible friend to me in my journey, but also an incredible friend to so many others that face this in life, and how to navigate it. And I think it's the type of an approach, it being that she is a former chief human resource officer. She understands how important this is, not just the organizational culture, but ultimately to the bottom line of the organization. So I just share that as a great resource as people think through this. Just another resource that can be incredibly helpful.
Great. Appreciate that. Thank you so much. And again, thank you so much for your time. And you know what, honestly, I'd love to be able to have this conversation with you again in a year's time, and maybe it's got a different flavor to it. We'll have to see. But yeah, I appreciate it, and I'd love to talk to you again.
Thank you, David.
Thanks. Thanks for listening to this episode of They Learn, You Win, presented by Skooks. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow or subscribe in your podcast player, and follow me, David Wentworth, on LinkedIn. I try to distill what works and what doesn't for L&D leaders so you can stay up to speed on the latest insights, ideas, and tech. See you next time.